Good evening to you all. I am Moapio Ngalo. I'm the managing editor of Inkani Books. And today I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of this very important book and to The Forge. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to join us in conversation today. Inkani Books is a people's movement-driven publishing house in Johannesburg. We publish accessible books that intervene in the battle of ideas, discussions around contemporary dilemmas of humanity with a focus on Pan-African themes, Marxism, and struggles in the global South. Inkani is a project of Tricontinental Pan-Africa, and today we're in the home of Inkani Books, The Forge, which is a Pan-African socialist hub for culture and politics. The Forge is dedicated to curating and hosting discussions and cultural works that engage in the battle of ideas, centering hope, community, and the necessary agitation for systemic change. We actively welcome collaborations and collective efforts that advance the cause for internationalist solidarity. Today, we are gathered for an incredibly important book launch. We are here to launch How the International Monetary Fund Strangles Africa, a book that asks a question that was first posed at the UN General Assembly by Nigeria's own Jaja Wachuku. Will the nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America remain spectators while others determine their fate? How the IMF Strangles Africa insists that the answer to this question doesn't need to be a yes, and it goes looking for alternatives. It also, as the authors put it, is an invitation to dialogue, and that's exactly where we begin today. To help guide our conversation today, we are joined by Jenny Ricks, right over here, who is the General Secretary for Fight Inequality Alliance, a growing global movement organizing to counter the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a small elite. Originally from the UK and based in Johannesburg for over a decade, Jenny has over 20 years' experience of social justice campaigning on a wide range of issues alongside people from across the world. We're also joined by Dalaya Ashenafi, who is an Ethiopian political economist and strategist whose work critically examines structural inequality, state power, and the emancipatory alternatives to development, challenging neoliberal orthodoxy and capital accumulation's role in marginalizing the global South. In a 2022 Asia Global Fellow, she studied state-owned enterprises through socialist industrialization and serves as a deputy principal of the Ethiopian Women's Research Network. Her scholarship on political settlements and late industrialization centers class struggle and Pan-African solidarity. And now on to the authors, Osingai. One of them is Grieve Chelwa, who is a Zambian economist focused on African economic development. He is an associate professor of political economy at the Africa Institute and a coordinator of the Collective on Political Economy, uniting emergent African academics and social movement leaders through emancipatory political economy. He previously lectured at the University of Cape Town and held postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard and Wits. His commentary has appeared on the New York Times, BBC, and Bloomberg. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. And then last, the other author, Vijay Prashad, who's joining us on screen today, a character. Vijay is the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, which is available on sale tonight, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. Vijay is also the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I'd like us to welcome our guests with a warm round of applause. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Abiwe. And yeah, what a great event to to have the privilege to help moderate and keep the conversation flowing, and that will involve everyone in the audience. So start thinking about the things that you would like to ask the authors and the panelists as we go along. So we're going to sort of open up straight away, I think, for some reflections, aren't we? Oh, Vijay first. Vijay first. Yes. So we're going to hear from you first, Vijay, to sort of ground us in this book and the conversation. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jenny. And I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person. It was a real joy to put this together with Grieve, and very grateful to the whole team at Tricontinental, particularly Tariro, who helped us with one of the chapters with her special skills in accounting, and to Apiwe for getting this out so quickly. I hope that this book helps to strangle the IMF rather than allow the IMF to strangle Africa. So that's, I think, the broader message. I had a little fun preparing for today because, Grieve is from Zambia. And Zambia this year had a program review, an Article 4 program review from the International Monetary Fund. So I went and had a read of that. Delia is from Ethiopia. I went and read the program review for Ethiopia, which was again an Article 4 review. And then just for the hell of it, the review on South Africa, which I actually really think is interesting. If you are interested, you can also read the review for Malawi and for Nigeria all this year, these 5. Fascinatingly, when you read these 5, you understand again very quickly that we're living in the same world we lived in 35 years ago. And I thought I'd make a little summary of what I think is the intellectual and policy contribution of the International Monetary Fund's Article 4 reviews of these 5 African countries: Zambia, Ethiopia, South Africa, Malawi, Nigeria. These are very important economies on the continent. All 5 had IMF reviews. Well, the first thing to say with any IMF review, you can't have an IMF review without the word stabilization. And so the first thing you have to do is stabilize, which means as far as the IMF is concerned, you have to suppress inflation. You have to curtail fiscal deficits. You have to be aware of your foreign exchange shortages, as if you were not aware of those before the IMF showed up, but that's important. And then having stabilized, there's a new use of the word sustainable, which I actually hadn't tracked very much. But this is the use of the word sustainable to go with debt. So we don't any longer want a debt jubilee from the International Monetary Fund. They never actually ever supported a jubilee. You don't really want a haircut. What you want is sustainable debt. That means you have to generate some primary surpluses. You have to restructure debt in a situation where it's unavoidable. But basically, they are talking about improving debt reporting. I found that very interesting, and limiting non-concessionary borrowing. So if you're limiting non-concessionary borrowing, where are you going to borrow from? So you got to make debt sustainable. Then they say you have to, and I love the words, the language is so interesting, consolidate your budget. This is another way to talk strictly about austerity, removing subsidies, restraining what they say. You have to restrain recurrent expenditure, and you have to curtail state enterprise losses. Regardless of the social costs of those state enterprise losses, they have to be restrained. You have to improve tax collection. Nobody is going to argue with that, except that they are very much not talking about collecting taxes on multinational corporations or ending transfer pricing. This is basically putting the squeeze on the middle class. And, this whole idea has entered IMF budgeting of creating priority areas in the budget that have to be protected, which is curious because, again, this is totally undemocratic. Somebody from outside is coming and telling a country what its priorities should be. Its national priorities are being set by the International Monetary Fund. Then, following the basic, elementary logic of neoclassical economics, the IMF reviews talk about the need for adjusting prices. Let prices adjust. So, on behalf of the international bond market, they talk about flexible exchange rates, market determined interest rates, cost reflective energy prices. What is this? What is a cost reflective energy price? When you have an illegal war being prosecuted by the United States against Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz basically shut down, now the Red Sea also under some threat. What is a cost reflective energy price? What they mean is no subsidies. That's what they mean, is let the energy prices reflect costs, which is runaway inflation for most countries. Then again, going forward, promote private sector led growth. I've always found this interesting, and I think Grieve and I, sort of digging around, came to an understanding that we need to be more specific when we quote them talking about private sector this or private sector that. Because once again, they're not talking about the domestic private sector. Let's be pretty clear about this. They're not talking about the creation of a Zambian capital sector or a Malawian capitalist class. When they say private sector led growth, what they mean is foreign capital. I mean, that's basically what this means. Liberalization, particularly liberalization, financial sector liberalization, is not encouraging the creation of a domestic financial elite. It's not encouraging that. It's basically encouraging big firms to come in and exercise leverage against smaller countries. Even when they talk about governance reform, restructuring of state enterprises, all these things, are not about the creation of a domestic capitalist class, except in a handful of African countries. Let's say South Africa, which is really a capitalism of its own kind. But if you take the other countries, Malawi, Zambia, Ethiopia, you're not really going to see these measures create a domestic capitalist class which is able to compete against multinational corporations. And finally, when you look at the reviews, they seem to suggest pretty strongly, and this is following from a kind of, yesterday's IMF, that there needs to be targeted subsidies, targeted cash transfers to the very poor, the deserving poor, and so on. No universal safety nets, universal subsidies, and certainly no talk of price controls, no talk even of capital controls. We noticed a few years ago there was some talk of capital controls, but that's really gone. So the International Monetary Fund, when it comes to the African continent, doesn't seem to appear to have a 2.0 or 3.0. This is the IMF 1.0 with new language. I don't think we should even be talking about a new generation of the IMF. It's the same policies, but they've really sharpened their language. Sustainable. It's a bloody tired word. And what I found interesting on that score is the appendix of our book, I think, is perhaps the most striking piece of writing here, because the appendix was a discovery from the South Commission archive. It was written by Alvin Taylor, who was the Director General of the African Center for Monetary Studies. And this was in December of 1987. The text is called The African Debt Crisis. But what I found so interesting, going back to the 1980s, the high point, what appeared then as the high point of the debt crisis, what I found so interesting is going back, is how many people how many people on the African continent at that time were talking about the need to build what we call, I think it's page 50, we call them Africa's institutions. How many people were talking about the need to build Africa's institutions? The African Monetary Fund, for instance, where would that be? The need to build an African investment bank, a Pan-African stock exchange, an African central bank. I mean, we're not even talking about socialism here. That's a striking thing, is nobody lays out what these institutions should actually be doing. But the very fact that there was a debate and discussion about 45, 50 years ago about the need for institutions that build thinking on what would be best for the national and continental priorities of the continent, that to me was astounding. And I'm very glad that we were able to republish Alvin Taylor's text as an appendix. Finally, there's a term that in the Institute we've been throwing around a lot, which is the term brain capture. Grieve edited a volume called Can Africans Do Economics? It's not such a provocative title. I recently was in Sri Lanka. I gave lecture at the University of Peradenia's economics department and at the University of Colombo's economics department. And in both places, I mentioned that book, the title of the book. And people thought, that's very provocative. And I said, is it really provocative? Because is there really a capacity for Sri Lankans to do economics? Or are we doing basically what the IMF tells us to do? Have we experienced something worse than state capture? Have we experienced brain capture? Are we allowing them to do our thinking for us? When will we learn to do our own thinking for ourselves? And for that, it's not just a matter of 2 or 3 intellectuals thinking, because obviously we can think, but rooting our thinking in institutions that have institutional memory, that have political power, that have authority to drive policy. When Grieve asked the question, can Africans do economics? He didn't mean, can individual Africans study economics? Yeah, obviously, yes, we are not silly. But can we do economics? Can we produce institutionally and lay out institutionally and politically a way forward that puts the national priorities and continental priorities at the heart of our work? That's the question from that book and for this one. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vijay, for kicking us off there. Thank you for reading the Article 4 program reviews so that the rest of us don't have to do that, and summarizing for us and laying out again that failed IMF recipe. There's so much jargonese in there, isn't there, that it's deliberate. It's a recipe it's deliberately designed so that normal people cannot even understand those ingredients. And also for laying out the history, and we'll go into that in more detail now, about the alternatives that do exist and have always existed, in fact. And as I was listening to your description of brain capture, the other idea, I think the very popular term in the last few years, it feels like gaslighting on an epic, destructive, disastrous scale. We throw that therapy term around these days, don't we? It's all the rage on TikTok, but it's gaslighting of the highest order, and it's life and death, actually. So thank you for that, for kicking us off. So we're gonna take some initial remarks from our brilliant panelists here before we get into conversation for the rest of the time together. So Delaya, over to you, please, or do you want to go first, Grieve? Your call. Go ahead, please, Grieve. Go ahead.
We'll save the best for last. Thanks everybody for being here. Really, thank you so much, Apiwe. Thank you to all my friends at Tricontinental. Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, Tariro. Thanks for everybody who's been involved in this project, because these are debates and conversations we've been having for the last couple of years. I'm not as sharp as Vijay. I've got to read written remarks. Vijay can speak in his sleep. I can't do that. So I'm going to bore you with written remarks. But I just want to say a little bit about writing with Vijay. It's an extreme sport, eh? Don't write with Vijay. So him and I would meet, right? And then he'll say, Grieve, you write this part, I write this part. And then the following day, I get in my WhatsApp 3,000 words. And then what he'll do, he'll send it to me and he'll say, your move, Grieve. So don't write with Vijay if you care about your health, your sanity. Don't write with this man. But yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read remarks here. So thank you, Apiwe, and everybody. Thank you, Vijay. It's been an absolute pleasure thinking with you. And Vijay has done a lot of the heavy lifting, right, which leaves me the easier job. So before I say anything about the book, I want to say something about how it came to exist. So at least my work and interest in the IMF, Vijay had been writing about international financial institutions for a very long time, right? He made his career pretty much, his classic books, The Poorer Nations of This World, Darker Nations of the World, really made the argument against the International Monetary Fund. I hadn't paid a lot of attention to the IMF until in September 2021, Jenny Riggs, who's sitting next to me here, sent me a DM on Twitter, right? Then it was X. And it was about what the IMF was preparing to do in Zambia. I had spent my career as an economist working on other things entirely, and that message sent me looking. What I found was the beginning of this book. So thanks, Jenny, for getting me interested in the IMF. So if you find anything useful in these pages tonight or in the book, some of the credit belongs to a message on a phone 5 years ago from someone who thought an economist ought to be paying attention. So thank you, Jenny. So I want to begin not with the book, but with this city, Johannesburg, where we are, right? In June of 1976, the children of Soweto walked out of their classrooms. You know what happened to them. What is less often said is what was happening at the same time in DC, in Washington, DC. In 76 and 77, and again in 1982 and 83, the International Monetary Fund extended credit to the government of apartheid South Africa. I want to be careful here because this is the kind of claim people ask you to prove. So let me say it plainly. That is not my allegation. It is recorded in the fund's own official history, written by the fund's own historian and published by the fund itself. Consider what that lending actually was. The fund was extending credit to a state that governed the overwhelming majority of its people without their consent. Those people had no vote. They had no voice in the parliament that asked for the money, and no say in what it was spent on. Their leaders were in prison or in exile or dead. And the world had been asked, formally, repeatedly through the United Nations, to stop financing that state. The fund lent anyway. And by its own account, the lending stopped not because the institution decided that financing apartheid was wrong, but because sanctions eventually made it impractical. Its own history records that sanctions were not, formally speaking, a barrier at all. So when we speak about the democratic will of the South African people, we should be precise about where this institution stood in relation to it. It was not neutral. It was on the side of the oppressors. On the 22nd of December 1993, after the unbanning before the vote, the executive board approved $850 million for South Africa. And the letter accompanying that loan had to be signed not only by the finance minister of the outgoing apartheid government, but by the representatives of the Transition Executive Council. Attached to it was a memorandum of understanding set out the policy South Africa would follow in 1994 and beyond. Now, here's the detail I'd ask you to hold on to. In preparing that loan, the fund's own staff sat down and calculated what it would cost to equalize government spending on social services across all race groups, to bring every South African up to the level of provision that white South Africans already enjoyed. The answer they arrived at was a budget increase of about 11% of GDP. After their conclusion, recorded in that same official history, was that this would be impossible to finance. The executive board agreed. It concluded that fiscal policy was constrained and that the new government would have to accept those constraints, right? So let us put the sequence together. An institution that had lent to the apartheid state over the objections of the world returned months before liberation to lend to the transition. And in doing so, worked out in advance that racial equality in social spending was unaffordable and brought that judgment into the conditions. the majority are still not voted, and the limits on what their government could do for them had already been calculated, agreed, and signed. So I did not come to Johannesburg to tell South Africans about South Africa. You know the story. So I raise this because it's the clearest illustration I know of what our book argues, right? Just how the IMF strangles Africa. So what happened here was not an episode. It was an instance of a pattern. Ghana has been to the IMF 17 times since independence. 17. That is roughly once every 4 years for the entire life of the country. And Ghana's first arrangement came in 1966, in the months immediately after Nkrumah was overthrown. Consider what that means. The fund's African career and the destruction of the continent's most ambitious independence project begin in the same year, the same country. That is not a coincidence that the archive allows us to ignore. That's not a coincidence that the archive allows us to ignore. Kenya has had 22 arrangements since 1964. Senegal more than 26 since 1979. And Kenya, as we speak, is negotiating the next one. So permit me the obvious question is, if the medicine worked, why does the patient keep coming back? A treatment that has to be administered 17 times is not a cure. It is a dependency. And the doctor who prescribes it 17 times is not treating the illness. He wants the patient to remain so ad infinitum, right? Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about Alwyn Taylor and the Center for Monetary Studies in Africa, the Center for Monetary African Studies that Alwyn Taylor was meant to establish, which I think is one of the most exciting things in our book. And Vijay found that particular text in the archives of the South Commission. So at this point, one usually hears a reply that there was and there is no alternative, that Africa returns to Washington because Africa has nowhere else to go. So let me tell you about an institution that almost nobody in this room will have heard of, and which we write about in the book. In May of 1973, the Organization of African Unity recognized something that took the rest of the world another decade to notice, that African states were walking into a debt crisis and that they had no institution of their own capable of helping them understand it. Several years of negotiation followed with the Association of African Central Banks. And in 1978, those central banks founded the African Center for Monetary Studies. They funded it themselves. It's important to know. They funded it themselves. They raised $500,000 between them. The largest contributions from Egypt and from Nigeria at 9% each. They appointed a Director General, Dr. Alwyn Taylor of Sierra Leone, an economist trained in Glasgow. The center had two tasks. The first was technical, to give African Central Bank somewhere to turn for analysis other than Washington. The second was political and long range, to lay the groundwork for an African monetary system, an African Central Bank, and an African monetary fund. It never got to the second task. The debt crisis followed everything. Taylor spent his entire tenure firefighting. In 1997, he held a conference of the Economic Commission of Africa. He told the conference of the Economic Commission of Africa that the continent faced not only the famine we could all see in the Horn, but what he called a financial famine. And then the center itself was closed. It could not be sustained. An institution built to help Africa think its way out of debt was defunded by the austerity that debt imposed. The IMF, I should say, has never had that problem. In 1987, Taylor wrote a paper for the South Commission. It sat unpublished in the archives in Geneva until Professor Prashad found it, and we produced it in full in the book. His argument then was that Africa's debt was being treated as unimportant precisely because it posed no threat to the international financial system, that the approach being taken rested on assumptions that were simply wrong, and that any durable solution requires creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and commercial, to share the cost rather than loading it entirely on the debtors. 40 years later, the common framework still refuses to do the one thing Taylor asked for. So when we are told that there was no alternative, the honest answer is that there was. It was designed, it was funded with African money by African central banks, and it was staffed. So let me close. Let me bring this to the present and to my own country. Zambia defaulted in 2020, the first African country to do so in the pandemic. In 2024, we completed the restructuring under the G20's common framework, and we were held up as a showcase, proof that the new machinery worked. Right, 4 years after defaulting, and then this was supposed to be like, wow, you can get debt resolution in quick time, only 4 years later. In June of this year, Zambia had to buy back one of those restructured bonds. Here's why. The bond was nominally due in 2053 at a token coupon, but it was written so that if Zambia's economy improved, the interest payments would step up and the maturity would shorten dramatically. In other words, recovery would make the debt more expensive. Our creditors, not our citizens, were the residual claimants on our recovery. So Zambia paid roughly 84 cents on the dollar to escape a bond it had just finished restructuring, thanks to the common framework, financed in part by a $600 million loan from the African Development Bank. We swapped debt we could in principle restructure again for debt that can never be restructured at all. And underneath the headline, the profile tells you the rest. Our commercial creditors will be paid out of the middle of the next decade. Our official claims, that is France and others, were not written down. They were deferred. Only about 5% of that stock is retired by 2035. The remainder falls during the late 2030s and into the 2040s. That is not relief, it is postponement. And the bill arrives comfortably after everybody who signed the agreement has left office, possibly gone to join their ancestors. Let me end where the book ends. This is not an argument that Africa is a victim. Victims have no agency. And the whole history I've just described is a history of African agency, of governments that chose, of central banks who built, of an economist from Sierra Leone who wrote a paper that nobody would publish. The argument is that the present arrangement is a choice. It was made by people in rooms with names and dates attached. Everything in our book has a name and a date attached to it. And what is made in rooms can be unmade in books. Chelwa's generation built an institution and could not afford. Chelwa's generation built an institution and could not afford to keep it. The question for ours is not whether an alternative is possible. They proved that it was. The question is what we built this time and whether this time we can pay for it ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grieve, for laying out the analysis and the story that is in the book. Thanks. That I've had the pleasure to go through before this event. So that sets the story of what is in the book. And Delia, so now turning to you for your sort of initial reflections when you heard the title, when you thought of this book coming, what came to mind for you?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thanks, Grieve, for the invitation. I first, met Grieve online. I think I read your first blog on "Cry, My Beloved Zambia," and it resonated with me so much because we were going through the reform in Ethiopia. So that's how I began following your work. So it's really great to be here and an honor, of course. And congratulations to both you and Vijay for putting this out there. This is a very important, thought-provoking book. For me, reading the book page by page, as the authors trace the structural mechanisms of debt, austerity, and policy capture across the continent, I could not help but see the mirror image of our own reality. So basically, what's happening in Kenya, Zambia, Senegal is playing out in real time in Ethiopia. So I don't know if many of you in this room know this, but our leadership in Ethiopia has famously declared that borrowing from the IMF is like borrowing from your mother. So the rhetoric framing multilateral financial institutions as benevolent family caretakers has served as the ideological cover for an aggressive front-loaded macroeconomic reform in Ethiopia. So basically, we've seen our currency being depreciated now at 150%, from 30% to 150%. Massive social spending cuts, removal of subsidies from fertilizer and fuel, which is affecting the everyday lives of Ethiopia. And this macro shock triggered immediate inflationary waves across basic goods, fuel, and food imports. Even the international financial institution can no longer obscure the material cost. And in a recent World Bank report, it was admitted that poverty assessments acknowledge that currency devaluation and the sharp rise in living costs in Ethiopia has directly driven millions more people into poverty. So severely eroding the purchasing power of urban wage earners and low-income households. So it's only the World Bank can actually admit such a policy. and get away with no accountability. And this brings me back to the core warning of the book. And I think that these programs do not represent a neutral, homegrown technical stabilization. They are a familiar structure look that sacrifice real development, sovereignty, and human well-being at the altar of market fundamentalism. So probably, I think 2 points that you mentioned in the book that you debunk that I find quite interesting. The first is that the IMF, does not do austerity anymore. And I think that's far from the truth. And it's a very important fact to put out there because what we've been told is that, it's fake austerity, that it does not exist. But the empirical data actually tells us otherwise. And there is a strong front-loaded fiscal consolidation, spending cuts, and regressive consumption tax remain central to the funds arrangement in Africa, and particularly in the program in Ethiopia. And the second one, which is very important as well, is that debt stress is strictly a product of domestic corruption and bad governance. So one of the key debates is that, we had to go to the IMF because, the previous leadership was corrupt, or the previous leadership, lost all the money. But what the book argues is that debt is fundamentally a structural crisis, right? So it's driven by a rapid financialization of capital flows via expensive euro bonds, external interest rate shocks, and massive corporate illicit financial flows, and transfer pricing that systematically drain capital from the continent. And I think this is very important because these are the key ideas that are used to dismantle, domestic pushbacks against these reforms. And the other thing is, I think that you have beautifully put out there is how the IMF and World Bank have captured our development policy imagination. And I connect so much with that because we're told that, we had no choice, we had no option. That's why, we needed to go to the IMF. And, economic sovereignty cannot happen without ideational emancipation. How are we able to think outside of the box? How are we able to think and connect these policy challenges with the realities on the ground? And what is the role of, not only the African working class, but, the elite class? Because the African comprador, these are like people who are, working with the IMF, with the World Bank. These are bureaucrats who are sitting in offices and who are actually making those decisions that you are talking about. How is it that, we are able to commit, class suicide, as Cabral would say, right? To think beyond our class, because these reforms might be reforms that, benefit us directly, but how can we think about for the broader society? And I think I like the fact that you also brought the conversation at home. It's not only about the IMF and some sort of office, but it's working well because there is a representation among Africans, and there is the idea that is accepted, and the idea is quite accepted among African policy makers as well. And this would be my last point, and I will end with a very interesting case that has happened in Ethiopia in the early 1990s. To understand what it truly means when a state takes control of its economy and the fierce retaliation it faces, I want to talk about a historical confrontation between the IMF and the Ethiopian government led by the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi during the late 1990s. And this story is documented in Peter Gill's book, where he talks about foreigners and famine, and he talks about economic warfare. So he's talking about how Ethiopia came to accept this initial IMF program, but there was a huge ideological difference between the Ethiopian government and the IMF. So, as usual, the IMF was recommending this, as usual, policies of, privatization, currency devaluation, and, the Ethiopian government realized that the IMF wants to do more than, policy advice. They actually want more. They want a seat on the table, and they want to make these decisions. So during the rule of the communist military regime, and this was the government before the 1991, loans were taken out of the American banks to acquire 2 aircraft for Ethiopian Airlines. These loans carried high interest charges and ridiculous terms, such as cross-collateralization, where repaying the loan on one aircraft would not release the lender on that plane until the entire debt for both planes was fully settled. So it was a way of keeping the Ethiopian government to constantly, stay within the loan and pay high interest rates. So seeking to eliminate high interest costs, the Ethiopian Airlines, backed by the Ethiopian government, decided to pay off the entire loan early and clear the balance early. Because Ethiopian state banks had sufficient foreign exchange available then, the Ethiopian government authorized the full settlement of the debt. Well, what you would expect is, this clear, celebration that, this is a country that has cleared out its debt, but it's actually the opposite that has happened. So the IMF objected fiercely, claiming that Ethiopia had not informed or consulted them prior to the transaction, and asserted that the state's foreign exchange reserves should not have been used to pay off commercial bank loans. And an insider story, which was Noah Gabra, was the chief advisor for the prime minister, states that. But the actual real reason why the IMF was not happy was that foreign banks lost out on a very lucrative interest payments and would have preferred keeping the high interest loans running on a schedule rather than receiving the early payoff. So, and not only that, Joseph Stiglitz, the chief economist of the World Bank, strongly backed Ethiopia's decision then. He noted that early repayments would make a perfect sense, right? To cut debt cost, arguing that the sovereign country should not need a permission from international bureaucrats for prudent financial decisions. But the fact that the Ethiopian government decided this came at a very huge cost of structural discipline. So basically, if you're having a fight with your friend and your friend loses a fight, that friend goes around and tells, other people trying to defame your name. So that's basically what the IMF started to do. So they suspended the lending terms. So they canceled the program. They began to signal to other donors that the Ethiopian government is not reliable. And I bring this up because these are the excuses that they use, when countries are trying to assert their sovereignty, that there's always, there's always a pushback. And by suspending the lending program, the IMF effectively downgraded the Ethiopia status to an aid recipient. Don't forget the word downgrade, because no African country wants to be downgraded. Sending a formal signal to foreign donors and financial institutions that Ethiopia was unreliable and high-risk partner. And on top of that, the IMF actively attempted to block Ethiopia from receiving debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. So the fund insisted that Ethiopia wait several years and maintain a new unbroken 3-year track record before qualifying for another loan. Ethiopia only managed to sneak through into the HIPC due to the immense international pressure then from campaigns like the Jubilee campaign. And finally, the IMF attempt to isolate Ethiopia partially failed, especially with the World Bank, because the former prime minister, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, had a close relationship with Stiglitz, and he was able to continue that relationship with the World Bank. And this is just one example to show that and Grieve and Vijay also demonstrate that when African states assert genuine fiscal sovereignty and put domestic developmental interest ahead of foreign capital, external financial institutions respond not with technical support, but with structural punishment. And I think at the end of the day, true emancipation requires us to recognize these mechanisms, break the ideological capture, and build the political will to defend national sovereignty against external control. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Delia. And hearing these national stories, hearing the arguments in the book unpacked through the lens of what South Africa has experienced, what Ethiopia has experienced, what Zambia has experienced, it really brings home the kind of devastation of the failed recipe. And it's not a one-off. It's, the pattern that you've showed, it's terminal. You're talking about the medicine, the failed medicine. We're looking at something that's terminal here, right? So, I'm the only person on the panel here who isn't an economist. And a historian. Okay. All right. Noted. But you've got maybe economist tendencies. I don't know, in that historian qualification, but fair enough. But I'm coming at the conversation also from the perspective of organizers and activists who are looking to change all of this, right? And coming at it from the perspective of being really pushed out, deliberately excluded from these conversations. The jargon is overwhelming. People will, the nodding heads, right? It's as soon as the stabilization and the exchange. Oh my God. I mean, if I'm a normal person in any way, shape, or form, I'm totally shut down at that point, if I was even in the room in the first place. So thinking about the conversation and the richness that we could get out of our comrades here, I asked some of the activists across our movement, across Africa, and some came through from Latin America, what did they want to know? So I'm coming at this from the other way in, if you like. So the first question I have for all of you is, the biggest issue that has come through our movement in recent times and will surely resonate. The biggest inequality issue that we're waging campaigns on is the cost of living. It's bubbled up because it literally is touching everybody in so many ways, differently, of course, but everybody nonetheless. So the first question is quite a simple one, really. What do you think the rising cost of living has to do with the IMF? And what can be done about it?
Okay. That's a very great question, Jenny. And most people, I think, can't make the connection between the rises in the cost of living and the role that the dirty role that the IMF has to play in that particular instance. I'll give the example of Zambia. Between 2022 and now, the cost of living in Zambia for the typical household, right, on minimum wage for the typical household, and there's a great organization in Zambia that's been collecting cost of living data since the 1990s. It's called the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection. It's presently run by Father Daniel Tale, who I went to university with. Incredible human being. And basically, they've been tracking since 2022, for instance, what's been happening to cost of living in Zambia. It's gone up by 50% since 2022, by half, right? Wages have stagnated. If anything, they have plummeted, right? If you have a job, right? And the primary culprit in the Zambian story has been IMF austerity. So the IMF has told the Zambian state, get out of any conversation or business, or remove that idea of regulating commodity prices, right? So essentially remove all subsidies, right? And this has had devastating effects on the cost, on just life of the everyday Zambian, right? And in 2021, when you sent me the DM, and then I went on this crusade, and then I sort of began to think about, oh my God, yeah, good kind of crusade. And I began to sort of make calculations and projections about what would happen to the Zambian economy, given that the new government then that had just been elected had chosen without thinking, without any imagination, to go to DC, to go to the IMF. I did tell the then president, who had just been elected, that 4 or 5 years down the line, you're going to be fighting for a political survival if you go down the IMF route. We're having an election in Zambia next week, Thursday. He is fighting for his survival, right? The IMF is a kiss of death, right? And so basically there is a direct link between cost of living crisis and IMF austerity. And I think the Zambian case, which I know pretty well, proves this particular fact.
That one's not on. Just for me to ask Grieve a follow-up on that before we take the other reflections, isn't it to bring it down a level again? If I'm thinking in my country, if I'm in Zambia, if I'm in Kenya, if I'm in Ethiopia, and I need my transport costs to come down, I need to be able to afford to buy a decent amount of food for my family, the nuts and bolts of the cost of living. And I kind of have this feeling, or maybe it's been told to me, maybe it's the brainwashing that this is just kind of inevitable. There's nothing really there's nothing that my government can do about it. Is that just total BS? And there's a whole bunch of things that I can absolutely demand that my government does.
I mean, that's true. Governments make choices all the time. I have a co-author who I've written a paper with, and he used to make the argument that government budgets are a statement of government values, right? So when a government allocates expenditure towards a particular issue, they're revealing their values, right? And when a government goes to bed with the IMF, the values become anti-poor, like pro-austerity, pro-big business. So there is always something that a government can do. And most governments in the world to regulate or manage the costs of transport, the cost of food, they often think about energy, because energy is the biggest ingredient in the cost of transport, the cost of food, right? So it be electric energy or it be petroleum, right? And petroleum, for example, Zambia doesn't produce any petroleum. It comes from other parts of the world. So Zambia has no say in what happens to the price of petroleum. Therefore, it is very important that the Zambian state regulates how that petroleum price then is transmitted from the Gulf to the price of bread, the price of milk, right? And the way you do that is by implementing what are called input subsidies. So you could control prices if you want to. It's the same thing, but you have to have some type of money set aside to cushion the price, so that transmission mechanism is not a full passing on from what's happening in the Gulf to the shelf or to the shop or to the grocery store somewhere in a rural part of Zambia, right? So it is always possible to do that, and the way you do it is you utilize input subsidies. Now, the government often will say we don't have money to do that. In the Zambian case, I'll tell you exactly what happened in Zambia. In Zambia, the Zambian state stopped subsidizing fuel because the IMF told them to do so. And then in a silly second act, they then gave tax concessions, right? So they used to collect about $1 billion more. They used to collect, basically what they did is they gave the mining houses, Zambia is a big copper producer. So beginning in 2022, they instituted a bonkers, but it's not bonkers if you think about it. It was written by Kristalina Georgieva in DC, managing director of the IMF, basically gave tax concessions to the mining houses that I estimate between 2022 and now are in excess of $1 billion. That's $1 billion that could have been used to cushion the price of bread, the price of milk, the price of transport. So it is a lie when a policy person tells you, but we have no choice, we have no money, we're up against the fiscal war. The governments are always making choices, and their choices are a statement of their values. Their choices are a statement of how they view their people. In this particular case in Zambia picked the big corporations and decided to screw over its people on whose behalf they govern, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Grieve. So we've got two villains here. We've got governments and the IMF in different roles. So Delia, any reflections on the same question about this connection between the IMF and the cost of living?
Yeah, I think just to build up on what Grieve has said, I think, for example, in Ethiopia as well, after Ethiopia has started implementing the so-called homegrown economic reform, it's called homegrown economic reform everywhere in Africa. I don't understand, by the way, like, imagine.
That's a rhetorical trick that Vijay is referring to, sustainable, homegrown. They will call it homegrown. It's actually written by them.
Yeah, but there's nothing, it's homegrown about it. And for electricity has gone up by 300%. Water has gone up by 150%. And public wages have not moved. So imagine. So internet costs, fuel subsidies, and even subsidies from like basic goods like wheat, oil. So these are like goods that everyday citizens use. And imagine that all these things have gone up and your salary has not moved a single inch. So at the end of the day, you're earning what you were earning, say 6-7 years ago, but everything around you has increased. The only thing that the Ethiopian government has done is that it has done a very strong rent control in Addis, because 70% of Addis Ababa residents are renters. So they know that if they did not do rent control, that everything will spike. So, and that they are trying, to move slowly, because again, they're told, remove yourselves from the market, let the market, regulate itself. So at the end of the day is that you see it in everyday, in everyday life. The only difference is people are asking, where is this coming from, right? So what we are trying to show is that, this is happening because this is what the state has committed to, and, I always tell, like my colleagues in Addis when we're debating about this, is that in Latin America, the day that, that the plane arrives and an IMF official lands, people are on the street because they know what's coming. It means more taxes have to be collected, more subsidies have to be removed, and people know the impact of this. It's the opposite with us because we don't have a full understanding yet what that means. And, when, the IMF president comes and says, the Ethiopian people have to be more resilient because, it's going to get tough before it gets better. It means they've actually pushed the government for more, and they say, oh, you have to sharpen your domestic resource mobilization skills. Basically, it means you have to collect more tax. And basically that tax comes from, like adding, the VAT. It doesn't even come from, taxing corporates. It comes from taxing the everyday people. So somehow people are feeling it in their day-to-day lives, like the cost of living. It's not really something you can avoid because it's just right here in your day-to-day life. But people are asking, what is actually driving that? Why is the government so keen? And then, after some few months, you're like, oh, Ethiopia just serviced this debt. Everything, the resource that was taken was from the economy so that the debt can be serviced. And every time that happens, you see that, there's much more squeeze, on the citizens and, which impacts their everyday lives.
Yeah. Thanks, Talaya. Yeah, it's debt before life, Any final sort of additions to that, this question, Vijay?
It's interesting because Delaya and Grieve have been very good on the direct relation between the IMF and the cost of living. But if you just pick up very briefly on what Grieve said about, let's say, the need for external reserves to pay for the importation of petroleum. Zambia doesn't have petroleum. It will need to import it. But does Zambia need to import everything? And why is there no domestic industrialization that permits an internal or regional market to be created so that African countries are not importing everything, which deepens the debt strangulation? And I think that's the broader question of coming back to thinking about planning, coming back to thinking about the public sector, coming back to thinking about an industrial policy. These things have just fallen aside. And by the way, we talk about borrowing and the cost of borrowing. The International Monetary Fund in July 2025 had a paper where they used the term which we use. I was surprised to see this term in an IMF paper. They used the term African premium. Do you know what an African premium is? It means that when the English government, British government, goes to the banks to borrow money, they may borrow at 3%, 3.2%, whatever. When Malawi goes to the same bank, it borrows at 7, 8, 9%. The spread between 3% and 9% is callously called by the IMF an African premium. So they even acknowledge. I mean, I don't know what to call it. Yeah, let's not throw moral language around. It's not racism or whatever it is.
Why not?
Well, let's just ignore it. I mean, let's just say this is what they call risk. That risky countries should have higher, interest. But then we are trapping ourselves in a comparative advantage of risk and reward. This is another kind of comparative advantage. You'll never have development. This kind of thinking is the entire opposite of development thinking. So, the answer to your question, Jenny, in a way, is that the antidote to the cost of living IMF nexus is really coming back to thinking about development. And I know that in certain postmodern circles and so on, the word development has been trashed. But let me tell you, from my perspective, nothing wrong with what development signified. If development signified the advancement of children's lives, I don't care, what NGOs have done to the term development or what W. Rostow did to the world modernization. We'll have our own interpretation of the words. Language is a fight. It's also the class struggle.
Thanks, Vijay. Okay, I'm going to ruthlessly move us on a little bit to a question that I got, which is more around how change happens. So we've kind of explored a lot here, the history, the economic structures that the IMF has really ruthlessly pursued with no deviation and no real chance of deviation. We've kind of laid out that story, and it's beautifully done in the book. So I had a question for you from a comrade who's asking, going back to something you already mentioned, that she's asking that many African governments claim that they have no choice but to go to the IMF. We spoke on this earlier. So she's asking what political and economic, and I would add social conditions would need to change for African countries to walk away from the fund with greater confidence. So what conditions do we see that would need to be there for governments to walk away and pursue and build the alternatives that some of which you've sketched out? And what role would you see for movements like Fight Inequality Alliance and many others would need to play, to help create those conditions? I don't know. I'm looking at you again first, because the animation on your face, the answer is on your lips. Let's go with you first.
Okay. Is this working now? Okay. Vijay and I have a chapter in the book, I think it's chapter 5, which we call A Framework for Emancipation, where I think we begin to try to provide some preliminary answers to questions like this. I think from our point of view, problem starts with debt, right? So debt is the entry point. As Thomas Sankara said in 1987, debt is a tool of neocolonialism. So debt is the entry point through which the IMF enters the kitchen. It is via the vulnerabilities that come with accumulating external debt, not domestic debt, debt in US dollars, right? So that's the first entry point. So we've got to reduce our reliance on US dollars. We've just got to find and figure out ways by which we don't rely on US dollars to finance the importation of things that are vital that we can produce domestically. And I agree entirely with Vijay when he makes the point about industrial policy. There is no reason why, Zambia should be importing, stuff from France or from the US and so on, or from Japan, whatever the case may be, because that leaves us then vulnerable. Some of those things we can produce domestically. Petroleum, before we get to a point where renewables do their job, we don't produce petroleum, so we still need to import that. So the point is, how do we extricate ourselves from the US dollar? Right? And I'm very glad my good friend Regin Kosi is in the audience here, because he's the expert on things like this, right? He's the expert in thinking about an emancipatory monetary policy for Africa, right? How do you de-link from the US dollar, swaps, arrangements, new currency arrangements, revisiting Nkrumah's idea to us for an African central bank with an African currency, those kinds of things, right, are going to be very useful. The other thing is we have to establish sovereignty over our natural resources, right? We have all these natural resources around that, which are the real assets of the people, and yet we don't own them. In Zambia, the copper mining industry, between 2000 and 2026, I estimate that Zambia has exported $400 billion worth of copper. For a country that is 10 million, 20 million, right? If you do the per capita number, it's huge, but you can't see this $400 billion anywhere in Zambia. The reason is that Our copper mining companies are owned by the Canadians. Everybody loves the Canadians, right? But the Canadians, they used to have that very cute, what you call him, prime minister before, whatever his name is, yeah.
Katy Perry's boyfriend.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, and everybody forgets that the Canadians do all sorts of nefarious things, right? So we have to reestablish sovereignty of our natural resources. Quite recently, I haven't told Vijay this story, but I was waiting for this moment to tell him. I wrote a critique of First Quantum Minerals on my Facebook, which is a Canadian mining concern. And they sent me an email from their corporate headquarters telling me to stop. Stop this or else, I guess, But we have to reestablish our sovereignty over natural resources. That's the second thing. Because then if we can capture that $400 billion, we won't need to borrow, right? And I think the third thing that we need to do is, which is what our book is trying to contribute, ideas, enter the battle of ideas, put new ideas on the table. This idea by this Sierra Leonean distinguished economist whose papers Vijay discovered are very useful, right? Ideas such as these ones. Put more ideas on the table. Sometimes we do blame our ministers of finance can be idiotic sometimes, but sometimes they just don't have the ideas, right? And I think so part of that is our challenge to us to put this. So I just, that's kind of like a three-pronged idea of how we can attempt to extricate ourselves from the fund.
Great. Thank you. And Delia, is there anything you could think of to add to that mix, and anything maybe more on because change, the process of change is also political, it's also social. What sort of mix of conditions would you, if that's the recipe, then what else would need to be in place for some of this to start coming to life?
I think at the beginning of 2018, there was this lecture. I forgot his name. This very well-known economist from an American university, and then basically what he came to tell us was that the Ethiopian developmental state was not working, and that was the actual message. But the way he got there was actually quite interesting because, he said, before Ethiopia attempts, developmentalism or developmental state, he said, you have to work out your identity issues, like ethnic issues, and then, come together as one country. All that is, development is a political economy and messy process by itself. If we could, we could, shut down all the, contestations around the Ethiopian state and then focus on development. But that's not how it happens actually, because all these things come at the same time. The state is being renegotiated at the same time. Unemployment is catching up with us at the same time. Foreign currency shortage is coming at the same time. Debt is coming at the same time. So, as a country, we're dealing with, multiple issues at the same time. So first is to say it's very difficult to say, this is what we should get right. But I think, at the very minimum, a minimum political settlement is very important, on how, there needs to be some sort of agreement among, keep people within the society. And I'm not talking about this elite pact or elite agreement, but an agreement, like among the society because these institutions, they prey on our vulnerabilities because, IMF came to Ethiopia, with shock therapy, basically, because of our political vulnerability. It was a very tough time of transition. There was a huge, power competition within Ethiopia. There was a lot of, unpredictable issues for the new leadership that was coming forward. And they could smell that this is a perfect moment, to introduce shock therapy and somehow show the government that this is your only choice. And that is what they argue about. They say, we had no choice because, we encountered this massive debt. We're supposed to pay these commercial loans, that we took and that the previous leadership took. So, this was not our choice. So even the diagnosis of the problem itself is done by the IMF and not really, we really never had a chance to sit internally, as Ethiopians and actually reflect, what went wrong. We were told by the IMF it's because, you had a massive, state spending, you had a massive infrastructure spending, or your politicians were corrupt, like they stole this amount of money, or this amount of money, left the country. There was, capital flight and all that. So I think that sense of, consciousness, among leadership, and this is not, a top leadership work as well. This has a lot to do with the role of the working class as well. That we have to think about, what went wrong, so that what could be, like our role, as a society, as a class, on what we can contribute to this. And I think it's within that we are able to actually imagine, right? Imagine, policies and choices that we can actually implement. So I think there needs to be, a consensus about what sort of leadership and model that we want, because my experience has been that has been one of our greatest vulnerabilities in Ethiopia, that we are yet to work that out. So we're constantly vulnerable, and we're constantly put at a place where we have to make difficult choices as a country. Thank you.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Without that, then you're always on the back foot, basically. Yeah. And Vijay, I'm also interested with your historian hat on. We've seen both recently with Gen Z protests in Kenya, with, in many other countries actually across the global south, some of which is very related to these issues, and also how these kind of pinch points have come in the past, in whether it's in Zambia in the 90s and so on, where the pain has gotten too much for people. And we've reached those moments of rupture where the cost, the food, the transport, whatever the trigger issues are in that particular circumstance, have pushed people to breaking point. Do we think there's a kind of different, whether that's going to be the kind of continuation, or do we see a different way forward for people to be able to envision the future they want, to demand a life of dignity? Or are we always going to have to hit that pain point before politicians have to react? How do you see that, that nexus?
Yeah, it's a very important reflection on the politics of the moment. It's striking that the median age on the African continent is about 19 and a half years. Roughly 60% of the African continent is under the age of 26. It's the youngest continent on the planet. Yeah, it's about half of Europe's age. This is really significant. It has very little to do with the American branding of Gen Z, I don't know what's next, alpha, beta, these dumb sort of branding exercises. This is a class struggle, because young people, middle class, lower middle class people who went to college, whose parents took out debt to get them to school, now can't find a job. They cannot be absorbed into the formal environment of work with decent jobs that are commensurate with their degrees. Those who don't have degrees are not even able to find decent work, for themselves. There are no industrial jobs being produced. We just can't absorb people any longer. And this is a problem. It's a existential crisis for these countries. And I'm hoping rather than go to anarchy, or to go into the absurdities of Bobby Wine and that sort of politics of I don't know, chaos, really. I mean, Bobby Wine has right-wing policies. Doesn't mean that it doesn't matter that he's standing up to Museveni. I mean, it's not a bloody choice of whatever, Coke versus Pepsi. We need to offer something better than that. And for that, we need to take this discussion of Gen Z away from generations and memes and so on, and take it substantially to the issues. And the issues are those that we are discussing today. A monetary policy, an industrial policy, a planning process in a country, democratic planning. What kind of jobs do people want? What kind of lives do they want to lead? Do we want to build countries, 54 African countries, where the capital city is everything and the rest of the country is, just absolutely neglected? Or do we want transportation networks, services? Why should people have to migrate to the capital city and live in slums and so on? These are questions of life and what people should be able to demand of their lives, of their futures, of their societies, and so on. So I think I really like your question because, we are not talking about economics. We are talking about life. And we're just approaching it from this angle. But we're talking about life and the young people that are frustrated. Yesterday, Julius Malema gave an interesting, statement where he said, you blamed the Zimbabwean migrant for the loss of your job. Have you got your job back now that the migrant is gone? You blame the Zimbabwean migrant for the fact that you had to live in the back room of a shack. Have you moved from the back room to the front room because you've chased out the No. He says the answer is no. That's a fraudulent, thesis that you absorb, the thesis that it's the migrant's fault. It's not the migrant's fault. It is an alien, a UFO's fault. Yeah, it's a UFO. But the UFO is the IMF, and the UFO is also capitalism. The UFO isn't some poor Malawian or Zimbabwean migrant in South Africa. Yeah, it's capitalism. And I think that's the message we need to take to the gen whatever. Yeah, alpha, beta, gamma, whatever.
Thanks, Vijay. I think we might need to take the conversation and the message into the memes. I don't think young people are going to be leaving their memes anytime soon by the amount of time I see folks spending on social media. So we may need to merge the method and the message together. So I'm gonna I did warn you earlier that this is going to be an open conversation. So I'm looking out to see does anyone have any questions, any contributions? We've got at least one there. And there's the second. The lights are square in my eyes, but I see at least two hands and a third. Okay, brilliant. Let's take those three, please.
Thank you so much, and so grateful for the discussion as well. I just have a question.
Would you just please introduce yourself as well?
Oh, okay. My name is Mbigizeli Mazibugo. Hope that's enough.
You don't have to be from anywhere or anything.
All right, thank you. So I just have a question. Prof Grieve, earlier you spoke about that the solutions, and one of them was claiming our sovereignty over natural resources again, and the other solutions. I just want to ask do you believe that there are these solutions can find a home, meaning that can there be new institutions that can be established, because outside of politics, I guess to a certain degree, of course, outside the IMF, like independently owned, just like the Organization of African Unity, maybe something of that sort can come back. And we, as the upcoming generation of economists, can maybe work on that, because how I would normally look at this is, I look at people like you and Vijay being doing the work for us and this yes and yes doing the historical work, and you, Prof, coming to criticize what we've always thought is normal and is true for us, and now it's our time to therefore implement these solutions that you are suggesting. Do you believe that there can be new formed institutions which can help us solve this illness or problem?
Brilliant question. You're speaking Grieve's language. He's loving that question. Let's take the other two, and then we're going to come back.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Prof, I would like to make this reminder. G20 was hosted here in South Africa, and all countries of Africa had some reservations, the governments. Actually, the declaration was made there, then to make the Western countries to stop this commodity extractivism. Because this is what is impoverishing Africa. You find Africans crisscrossing the world. There's no other continent that has migrants as Africa, and yet there is no continent that is rich as Africa. So it was also highlighted about that in Eurozone, 80% of their GDP is made of commodities from our continent. So it was said that that should stop now. All the materials that are produced locally should be done here. This decommodification must be done, must happen here in South Africa. Then I heard that just a good example in South Africa, pharmaceutical initiative has been started at one of our universities, Wits and UKZ. The medicines that were used to imported from America. But now those IPs now, the brands are going to be owned by us. Then also was highlighted the East countries, the cocos, the chocolates that are done there in Sweden, and then resent to us back at a very expensive price. So I think if we don't change that mentality, then this debt will always accumulate. And now another question: could it not be possible then to via BRICS name, a BRICS bank, and then to get rid of the Western countries? Could it not be a viable model? Zimbabwe, there was something that said now that the diamond is going to be refined in Zim. So that is going to give citizens jobs. What is your response there, Prof? How soon could that be implemented and then stop this thing of Africans being xenophobic and et cetera, et cetera?
Right.
Thank you.
I think all the profs. So we've had two great questions. We've got the new institutions and how we're going to build them. We've got questions there around industrialization strategy and your reflections. I think I know what's going to be said about the G20, but also BRICS. And please, sir.
Thanks very much. My name is Reggie, of course. I'm looking at the book. I've not read it. It should be wonderful, isn't it? Grieve, Vijay, Prashad, thanks for being here. It's wonderful. When I was coming in, Jenny touched on some word, some phrase like intellectual capture or something like that. But it's not a question, it's just a comment. The truth is, all of us here, all of us even behind here, are all owned by the IMF, the World Bank, and a few of these institutions. We are owned. It doesn't matter whether we want it or not, we are owned. So it's not just the intellectual capture. I think that's more broader. There's policy capture, regulatory capture, cognitive capture, rule-making capture. I'm a former civil servant. It's government. Almost all the policies that we used to make, from an economic ministry, by the way, okay, our thinking completely tied around the World Bank. World Bank's thinking and all manner of activities. So we are all captured and owned. Unless we break this link, it will be perpetual. This is not just for Lusaka, for Pretoria, New Delhi, Brasilia, or Addis Ababa. It's right across. And I think that need to delink ourselves is extraordinary urgent. Now, Grieve, of course, I came in late. Vijay had just talked. Grieve and Delia talked to very important issues. And Delia mentions the word domestic resource mobilization, the phrase. We should criminalize that phrase. It's criminal. It's an intricate macroeconomic phrase that's so difficult to disentangle. But how common it is, everybody around, in parliaments, in academia, teachers use it freely. It's have to criminalize because it starts from things like that. I mean, they're telling Ethiopia, they're telling Johannesburg and everyone else, let's go and mobilize some resources. It's absolute nonsense. I think we should begin to think very differently about that. To me, what we should be, to answer your question, in fact, what should we begin to do is to domestic resource creation, not mobilization. The word mobilize is very, very dangerous. So we have, therefore, phrases like these that enslave the developing world. The debt management program. I was talking about the fact that, Ethiopia paid quite quickly and, these fellows got annoyed and so on and so forth. The debt management guidelines from the IMF and the World Bank, total enslavement. Complete enslavement. However, academics haven't sat down to basically say, well, this is nonsense, let's remove it. But even if they were to do that, it could be me, Grieve, Vijay, and so on. But these fellows can actually even say we're talking nonsense, no matter how solid our mathematics may be, to disengage that logic. So there's a lot, including the data again that we're talking about. I think I talked this in Lusaka. Grieve kindly invited me to Lusaka not long ago. The structure, well, many people talk about the architecture, but the architecture that we use right now is itself bogus. It is enslaving the developing world as much as it is enslaving anyone who doesn't understand it. Senegal, 132% of the GDP debt. It's just messy. So what I'm trying to say is we are trying, some of us, I mean, here is Grieve and Vijay writing this to help solve the challenge. Academics are trying to say, forget about the phrase domestic resource mobilization. It's a nightmare on the developing world. Reorganize the debt guidelines from the IMF. And so on and so forth. So yeah, there are efforts that are being done that I'm afraid to take quite a while.
We're gonna hold. In our introduction, we talked about holding hope in the conversations held here at the Forge. So we're gonna come back to the panelists now. You had 3 huge questions, reflections there. You've all gone straight to the heart of the matter on new institutions, on industrialization, on these layers of capture, on so many aspects, and how do we move forward? You can take I'm going to go the other way round, just to relieve Grieve of his first answers for once. So Vijay, take a go at any and all of that.
I mean, I would like to take a go at all of it, but let me just say one thing, which is something that all of us, Grieve, Delia, we've talked about this for a while, which is, there's a need to also rethink the basis of some of these epistemologies, such as economics. Yeah, what is economics? Should economics be taught in let's say in Zambia using Paul Samuelson's textbook? Does it make sense to assume that the methodological individual in Zambia is possessive and is a maximizer? Does every Zambian act like a maximizer? Do we start there? Do we start without an acknowledgement that Zambia is a country with, a list of resources, fill in the blanks, and then so much deprivation? How do you square wealth and deprivation? Shouldn't our students at the University of Zambia begin with that conundrum? How do we have all these resources and yet have all this deprivation? Go in and write a paper. This is your first week's assignment. We're not going to look at a demand curve. Yeah, because a demand curve is alienating. It immediately takes you away from your own experience of economic activity and alienates people's own experience with a graph. And a graph which is about a psychosocial template that is not necessarily universal. We don't all operate on the basis of maximizing as our impulse. So wouldn't it be a good idea to, in fact, teach economics in a popular way, completely differently in different places? Come to the heart of what is the economics of this place. Yeah, not what is economics, but what is the economics of this place and what kind of future can it imagine? Aren't those the popular debates and discussions one wants to have? And not enter into the trap of fixing systems technically with an epistemology that is not actually fit for purpose. I agree. What is demand management? That's another one. Demand management effectively is the suppression of calories to people in our countries. They should eat less. They should have less leisure. That's demand management. There's a heartlessness to the way in which we are forced into a conversation. And what we are saying is we need to start different kinds of conversations, not to take economics and throw it out. Of course not. I fundamentally believe that the material base is the center of the conversation. Not to do that, but to have a different conversation and to welcome in people who are often brought out. And this used to be called popular economics, yeah, in the old days. And I think we need to go back to a lot more of that, a lot more of writing about economic activity for people where the text itself is not alienating. And I hope that what Grieve and I have produced here is popular economics. We want movements to study this. It's an extremely short book. We want movements to study this, to debate this, and to construct, a movement-driven vision for the economic and social future of communities, of countries, and of a continent.
Thanks, Vijay. An important orientation. We come at this thinking and trying to discuss, what does an economy that serves the 99% look like? What does it do? Though that's the starting point. The anchor is not GDP or inflation or these other measures that people just are not. If you're not a trained economist, it doesn't make sense. It's what is do people have jobs? What are the wages like? How much does electricity cost? How much is people's transport? The things that the economy is here to serve for people, every person to have a life of dignity. Delia, take your pass at these huge existential questions.
The first two questions were for the prof. So
nicely done. Nicely done.
Vijay talked about centering the human, like in the economy. And I think that's very important. But I just want to add to that is there's, I think, like a historical amnesia that exists, I think, in the development discourse. And I think somehow, history has been erased of how development was done. And then, it's like a new book has been written, particularly for the global South, right? So And if you're a big fan, you've read Hajun Chan's book and all of his books, and he, in detail, shows the empirics of how the global North was driving development, right? So, and there is like this very, unashamed hypocrisy on how these policies are advised. And for me, I mean, that's just, I don't know, I have no words to express that, because there's like the DAG, the Development Assistance Group in Ethiopia, where you have different donors come together and discuss on how they can support Ethiopia's, economic, policy. They are recommending policies that they do not practice at home. And this is today. It's not even in history. And this is today. You have, Norwegians, and you have, the Finnish, which have like a very strong social democracy, social welfare programs. And they are telling you, we need to cut spending. We need to help the Ethiopian government. And I don't understand is that you do not want to do that to your people. And this is not a policy that you'd go back and present to your people. How can you advise this government? And we are dealing with much poorer people, by the way. And these are people who need more, not less. So these are the people whom we should push the government to do more, not less. And you're telling this government that, you need to cut spending so that you can save more money and pay your debts to private bondholders, by the way. And these are people who don't even need the money. And I think there is just, the moral bankruptcy behind, development advice. It's just baffling. And thank God we can read and we can comprehend history. And you see that what has happened in history is what these countries have done to actually invest in their economies, the amount of protection, the amount of subsidies, and the amount of support they give their domestic investors, the amount of investment they do to back up their corporate investments across, like multinationals across Africa itself. So I think the empirical evidence exists. It's there. And we don't have to really dig that far. Thank God. There are giants before us who've done a lot of work for us to go back and to refer to these issues. But I think it's just, there is, a defiance to say that, there's nothing, that, Africans can do about it. And to be honest, this does not make me feel any less hopeful, but more, like at least, militant in some sort of knowledge production way, right? So that, that we know where these policies are coming from, and we will continue to flag them for our people, for whoever who will listen, And at the end of the day, the structure that we're fighting with, like I relate so much with Rage, like, the structure is just so entrenched, so strong. So the people we're debating with today, are not some, American IMF or, like British advisors. They're Ethiopians. I'm talking to my Ethiopian, brothers and sisters and debating this policy with them. So that's very painful. The battle is real. The class struggle is very real and on a day-to-day basis. But this is a very important battle to engage in, because this determines, this is a multi-generational battle. Like that, this is something that we put today and we move forward. And every day, we always say that, if the Ethiopian government chooses to change its mind, we're happy. Even today is a good day to change. You'd never say I've come too far and I can't change this policy. Any day is a good day to change this policy, because the impact is much more worse than than it would have been. So I'm quite hopeful, but also bringing to the table what development looked like in history is, I think, very important. And I found that to be very, very powerful, because I'm talking about how the US did it, the UK did it, France did it, and how we can also do it better, by the way. I mean, our learning curve, there's a lot of leapfrogging that we can do. We can do it better. And it was done at a huge human cost. We can do it at less cost because there's a lot of learning for us. So I feel quite hopeful there. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Vijay agrees. So we've had two sort of thoughts on, some sense of how to get Reg out of his existential despair a little. So then we had couple of other questions hanging there. So yeah, go for any and all of them.
Thank you. You see why I hang out with Dalaya. She's exactly what Walter Rodney described as a gorilla intellectual, right? And we need more intellectuals of the type that Dalaya represents. Yeah, I mean, Reg, by the way, is very right. And I invite everybody who's in the audience and who's going to be watching this to buy our book, right? Can Africans Do Economics? Because in that book is a chapter written by Reg titled A Monetary Policy for Africa. And basically, in that chapter, Reg is arguing for a reimagination of monetary policy. Our central banks are so fixated on interest rates targeting, but Reg is producing their framework of how our central banks can escape this obsession with interest rates. And, funny enough, the US Fed, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan have always done much more than interest rate policy historically. They have always been tools of industrial policy. They have always known that they're playing a political project and a project of development, right? But in our case, our central banks are so unimaginative. The worst thing that you can do is appoint me to a board in the central bank. I'll die of boredom. The Central Bank of Zambia, right? It's such a potentially powerful institution is reduced to such a boring task, right? So Reggie's chapter, I think, is worth reading in this particular instance. And your question, Bekezeli, is an important one, right? And again, talking about history, as Dalaya has said, it's not like we've never tried to establish sovereignty over natural resources. We've nationalized many times, right? Except that our leaders have often been killed. Salvador Allende, in the case of Chile, right? In Zambia, Kaunda nationalized the mines in 1969, setting forth 3 decades of prosperity, broad-based prosperity, socio-economic transformation, social mobility, right? Zambia owes what it is today, at least what little that has remained, that resembles dignity to what Kaunda did in 1969 when he went to a historic township, a historic working class township called Matero, and delivered the Matero Declaration, which said, from today, we buy back our dignity, which is to say we establish sovereignty over natural resources. So it is possible. It's just that the nationalization word, the N word, has been made very dirty by the IMF and World Bank. Dalai was talking about the Norwegians. They're supposed to be very nice people, right? They funded a technical assessment project in Zambia on domestic resource mobilization. And there was a wonderful workshop held at a hotel there where they were releasing the results. The Director General of the Norwegian Tax Agency was there. Somebody from NORAD, the Norwegian aid agency, was there. And our central bank governor was on the panel. And our Director General of the Zambia Revenue Authority was on there. And they spent much of the time sort of trying to make technical arguments about how can we raise more taxes from Zambia's mines. And Grieve was sitting in the back, raised his hand, that time. I wasn't very confident, but I tried. I said, you know what, you guys have spent the last hour, you've spent so many thousands of dollars on this technical report, trying to sort of finicking about how we can raise more taxes. Why don't we just nationalize the mines, is the question I asked, right? Just forget the middleman, middlewoman, just nationalize the mines. Once the mines are ours, we'll never have to play ping pong with these Western mining houses. Then they are ours, and we collect the revenue ourselves. And then there was like, I think there were some people had a stroke on the panel when they heard me ask this question. Could see like some people having a stroke, pause, and then they laughed at me. It doesn't work. It has never worked anywhere in the world. What hypocrisy. Norway, through Statoil, owns its oil resources, which have been used to accumulate one of the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world worth $1 trillion. Norway has more money than it can ever spend, precisely because it has established sovereignty over its natural resources. In 1974, the UN Secretary General then, Kurt Waldheim, and Vijay and I talk about this in the book, produced a report for the General Assembly. The General Assembly, and this just tells you how the UN has fallen so far from what it used to be. The General Assembly tasked the Secretary General to produce a report on the possibility of establishing sovereignty over natural resources. And Kurt Waldheim made that argument in that particular report where it is possible. And we've done it before. the periods in our continent when we've been able to thrive are the periods when we've owned our natural and productive resources. Ethiopian Airways is a success story, precisely because Ethiopian Airways is owned by the Ethiopian people, right? Those kinds of things. So very quickly, the question about BRICS and G20. I'm not very hopeful, right? Especially G20. I know Reg, you and I, especially you did a whole lot of heavy lifting for the G20 conference last year, and I wonder what your judgment of it. But I've experienced the G20 through the Common Framework, which has completely wrecked Zambia over the last 5 years, right? BRICS also, what worries me about BRICS is not quite clear what the political project is. I don't understand what the political project is, that interesting configuration of countries, right? Is it a non-aligned sort of movement? Is it a third world project? I'm not very sure about its politics. Maybe Vijay might be much more hopeful than I am. They're doing some very interesting things on the economics, right? Talking about the BRICS currency, but also it's an exclusive club. Very few members, right? Even the institutions they have set up, like the BRICS Bank and the Contingent Reserve Facility, the capitalization of them, the amount of money that they have at their disposal is tiny vis-a-vis the World Bank IMF. They're not a threat to the World Bank IMF. In fact, the Contingent Reserve Facility of the BRICS Bank, in some ways, for you to access it, the BRICS Bank requires that you get a stamp of approval from the bank and the fund. So it is not really a rupture, right? I think the question that Mbekezeli asked about, we need to recreate, imagine very, very so radical and imaginative institutions. So that's just my response to some of these questions that come from the audience.
Thanks, Grieve. So it's the end. We need to draw a close to the discussion. And I'm going to do something which typically economists and historians don't like. And I'm going to come to you all for a one-liner in a second on something. So, but just to say, obviously the book is here. It's for sale. You should buy it. Grieve will be here to sign your book. There can be photos, any of those things. Please do stay and chat. And if there's more questions that you haven't had a chance to ask, we can stay and argue about the G20 and anything else that you want to talk about. But I wanted to get the panelists to close us off, not me. I want to thank, I think if we can actually thank our three panelists, both for this wonderful, wonderful book and its contribution, and to Delia for being here for the reflections and the provocations, and the brilliant team at Forge and Inkani for making all of this possible. So thank you all, and for you guys for coming and for staying on this Thursday night. Well done. I'm going to ask the three of you to give us a line. We're in our movement, we're mobilizing against the World Bank and IMF meetings. They're not in DC this year. It's DC, but it's not in DC. It's being held in Thailand, in Bangkok, in October. There's people mobilizing in different countries against the cost of living, against, maybe new loans that their governments are negotiating in Kenya, in Zambia. Give us a message, a one line from this book, a slogan or one line that speaks to you that we should carry on to the streets as we're trying to put forward these alternatives, as we're pushing back on the current reality. What's the one line or one message from this book that you want to give to campaigners? Vijay, I'm going to start with you. Tough question, sorry.
No, it's okay. One line, right?
Yeah, I'm being tough. Yeah. We're wrapping up.
Yeah. Tell the IMF to teach the United States a lesson and leave Africa alone.
Okay, there's a round of applause for that one. Delia, what would be your message?
There's no such thing as technical advice. It's a political advice.
Okay. There you go. And Grieve?
Thank you. I mean, this I'm not good at. This is why I never worked in advertising. I'm not good at one-liners. I just burn it all down.
Perfect.
IMF must fall. IMF will fall.
There you go. You're speaking to a room full of South Africans. The IMS must fall is a good slogan to end on. So thank you all again for coming. And yeah, what a brilliant event. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jenny. Really, thank you for accepting to moderate this, though. Thanks a great deal.
Yes.
And thank you, Vijay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we miss you.
Book is available for sale.
Yes. And if you happen to read the book and you'd like to write a review, please do. We recently launched a review platform called Inkani Review, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us.